Welcome back to some of you. Welcome back to enough of you that I'm not going to repeat the whole big welcome that I did last night, but instead what I'll do is just take a few minutes for those of you who weren't with us to give you a fast-paced sort of recap, and then also a brief Twitter-based highlights reel of our discussion last night. So after we started off by me outing myself as a recently former technophobe, and thanking my extraordinary co-organizers, one of whom is hiding behind the screen here, Kelly Joseph, and the other who's down at the end over there, Alex Hill, thanking them both for really bringing me out of my stubborn, self-imposed, narrowly analog darkness. I gave something of an origin story of this event, and then also what it means for the Small Axe project to have pushed even further than it has into the realm of the digital as essential to our understanding and our promulgation of Caribbean studies in the academy and in the wider world. So I'd sketched out briefly what I hope will be our offering in this forum, that is a physical and virtual space within which folks doing digital humanities work around the Caribbean and its diasporas might be in generative conversation, think through their own projects and those of others, talk through the contours and the new valences of our field as they're shaped and produced by the affordances of technology. And also just show off all the cool stuff that we're doing. That's kind of the biggest thing even. And I should add that we intend, David's blood pressure and my sleep debt and our funders permitting, we intend to make this an annual Small Axe event. So this is just the beginning of the conversation. New digital work, new work on the digital is, as you all know, constantly emerging. And we want to know about all of it, so we're going to keep going. I also mention, and I think this is important to keep saying, that we conceived of this event as something of an experiment. We wanted to push at the limits of the digital and in the Caribbean to get a sense of the challenges produced within this pairing. Again, as I said yesterday, to what extent is it really possible to facilitate conversation and to build scholarly community in the absence of physical presence? So leaving ourselves very much vulnerable to the challenges and snafus of technology. And full disclosure, that was my way of sort of backing into a little bit of a prayer to the DH Pantheon that the Skype and the live stream will continue to work. So you can all feel free to join me in that prayer. I'll be muttering it under my breath for the whole of the day. And then I close my remarks by thanking a lot of people, because it took a lot of people to make this event happen. And as you all also know, just because it's digital doesn't mean it's free. And we used a lot of resources, human and capital, to get to this point. So more quickly, but as sincerely as yesterday, I want to thank the Columbia Center for the Study of Social Difference and the members of the affiliated Digital Black Atlantic Project Working Group for their multi-pronged support. Thank you to Columbia's Committee for Online and On-Campus Learning, acronym COOL, for giving me keys to the car and a generous amount of pocket money to play with. To the folks at the Center for the Digital Research and Scholarship for supporting our gorgeous website, and of course to Rodell Warner, who gave us this stunning image that really, as I said yesterday, is a testament to what the digital can do. Thank you to Barnard's Africana Studies Department, to Events Management. If you missed last night, you missed a Caribbean feast, but there'll be more food today. And thank you to Instructional Media and Technology in the back there at Barnard. We are, as I keep saying, an exceptionally tech-heavy event operation, and I do thank our tech team for their willingness to help us try and limit the obstacles to connection and community. May the Skype and the live stream work. Lastly, I thank two other people, and I thank again our graduate assistant, our graduate fellow, who worked all this semester and last semester to support our dream. And thank you to David Scott. David is the heart and the soul and the brain of Small Axe, and the endlessly giving gift that the journal and its satellites have been. And Alex, Kelly, and I are very grateful for the generosity, for the reasonably cautious generosity that he has shown as we've been imagining the Small Axe project's possible futures. After my welcome, Dean of the Humanities, Sharon Marcus, the brilliant and eloquent Sharon Marcus, said a number of, as you may remember, brilliant and eloquent things, connecting the digital humanities to the various networks that undergird our research institutions in ways that are not dissimilar, of course, to the networks that facilitate the movement of cultural products, people, and ideas in the Americas. She had read through all of our abstracts in preparing her remarks and actually took us on sort of a whirlwind tour of the conference, which left me thinking about how damn impressive we are. And like, we are really impressive. And so that was very nice. And then we had our opening plenary panel, led by Kelly Josephs, who started things off by announcing that the Brathwaite Researchathon, thank you very much to those of you who participated yesterday. The Researchathon yielded 550 entries, so we are off to a very good start with that. Yeah, and that too is damn impressive, I'd say. And then yesterday's opening plenary with Brooke Wooldridge of D-Log, Rhonda Cobham-Sander, Donette Francis, and Leah Rosenberg was fantastic. And this is where I'm going to turn to Twitter for a second with a few choice morsels, a mix of truth statements, some admonitions, a few pleas, and I'll spare you the shout-outs because there were a few of those too, just kind of pure Twitter love. So just a few of the quotes from Twitter. Tweet: how do we think the digital through the humanities, not just the humanities through the digital? Tweet: in the archives, Asian women are not always docile. Black women do not just stay home. Another tweet: the Caribbean digital, making global pasts visible. Tweet: I've often said, Brooke, you'll recognize yourself here. I've often said, digital projects have such a short shelf life, they should be measured in dog years. Another tweet: what does it mean that the existing tenure protocol still hasn't figured out how to judge digital humanities?
That's not true.
Tweet: we are just another iteration in the historical record, and we bring our own influences to our particular intervention. Another good tweet: I have no interest in building anything that doesn't have analysis in it. Two more. Tweet: don't write your article as your DH project. That doesn't count. And then maybe my favorite one, tweet: the colonial archives are many things, none of them logical. And so anyway, that's just some of what came out of that kickoff conversation. And all to say, we hope that the event will continue in the mode and the spirit initiated yesterday evening. And as I myself tweeted at one point, and since I've already been mocked pretty mercilessly, mostly by Alex, for saying this, I'm just gonna own it. I tweeted: it feels great to be here with the cool kids. Hashtag SXCD 2014. So thank you. Who's moderating? Alex?
Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Somebody who has been in the space of the Caribbean and in the space of the digital for almost a decade now, seeing us all come together here is really special to me. It's my honor to introduce our first panel of the morning, which will bring together Praxis in the archive and in the classroom. We have a distinguished panel of guests. Our morning panel, will be our longest panel today. It's a plenary. So I ask you to stick it out with us. I am going to be very, very tough with our panelists, asking them to stay within the time limits. And we are going to actually change the plan a little bit and start with our guests on Skype. I'll get to that in a second, though. Now, please allow me to introduce our speakers. Laurent Dubois is the Marcello Lotti Professor of Romance Studies and History and is the founder and faculty director of the Haiti Lab of the Franklin Humanities Institute, which you may have heard of. He is the author of 5 books, including Avengers of the New World, the story of the Haitian Revolution, and A Colony of Citizens, a revolution and slave emancipation in the French Caribbean, 1787-1804, which won 4 book prizes, including the Frederick Douglass Prize. He has also written about the politics of soccer, with Soccer Empire, the World Cup, and the Future of France, and is the founding editor of the Soccer Politics blog. His most recent book, oh, by the way, and a great Twitter during the World Cup. If you don't follow him, you should. He's currently writing a history of the banjo as an African-American instrument. He has received the Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Humanities Fellowship, and Mellon New Directions Fellowship to support this work, some of which is showcased on the Banjology website. His writings have appeared in The Nation, the New Yorker website, Sports Illustrated, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times. And his Twitter account is Soccer Politics. Thomas C. Speer is professor of French. Sorry, I'm not going in order. Sorry, I skipped that. Roger Carruth is a native of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and holds a PhD from Howard University, a Juris Doctor degree from Atlanta's John Marshall Law School. He also holds a Master of Public Administration degree with concentrations in international development and administration and a Bachelor of Arts in Mass Communications, both from Clark Atlanta University. He is currently a postdoctoral research fellow for academic diversity at the University of Pennsylvania Annenberg School of Communication. Prior to that, he had a one-year appointment as an assistant professor in the School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State University. He has taught as adjunct assistant professor and lecturer at Baruch College, Sickland School of Business, and Queens College Political Science Department, both a part of the City of University of New York of CUNY. Courses taught includes speech introduction to communications, media and society, group discussion, family business, public service, public administration, judicial process, American government and politics, and political science and media law. All right. To his right is Thomas C. Speer, professor of French at Lehman College and the Graduate Center of CUNY, author, No what? Okay. Author of numerous articles on French and Francophone novelists. He specializes particularly on forms of autofiction. His publications as editor include Un journée haïtien, Mémoire d'Ancré and Présence africaine, 2007, and with Colette Boucher, Paroles et Silence chez Marie-Célie Agnon, Carthala in 2013. His online bibliographies and Francophone resources predate the graphical web interface. Since 1998, he is editor of Il en Il, an archive, featuring authors for French-speaking islands. And of course, this is those of you who have Facebook, you can follow along the activity of Il en Il there. Joining us on Skype, and I'll come back to our panelists to my left, are Romain Cruz, Kevon Rainey, and Johannes Bo. No? They're not all on. Just not Romain. So Kevon and Johannes are there. Okay, Kevon and Johannes will join us on Skype. They're going to be talking about the Caribbean Atlas, which is an interinstitutional collaboration all around the Caribbean and beyond, aimed at bridging the digital gap in the Caribbean. It offers a scientific platform where established Caribbeanists and young researchers can publish the result of their research in the social sciences and physical geography. And of course, they'll be expanding on that, so I'll let them do the talking in a second. To my left, I have Elizabeth Maddock Dillon, professor of English at Northeastern University, where she is founding co-director of the new lab, NULAB, for Maps, Texts, and Networks, and teaches in the field of 18th century transatlantic literary studies, with a focus on early America and the Caribbean. She is also the co-director of the Futures of American Studies Institute at Dartmouth College. She is the author of New World Drama, The Performative Commons in the Atlantic World, 1659-1859, which recently came out of Duke University Press, and The Gender of Freedom, Fictions of Liberalism and the Literary Public Sphere, which came out of Stanford University Press in 2004, which won the Hyman Prize for Outstanding Publication in the Humanities at Yale University. Together with Michael Drexler, she is co-editor of the forthcoming volume, The Haitian Revolution and the Early U.S., Histories, Geographies, and Textualities. She is currently a distinguished visiting fellow at the Advanced Research Collaborative at the CUNY Graduate Center in the fall, so we have the pleasure of having her here in New York for a little while longer. In spring 2015, she will be a visiting fellow at the Warren Center at Harvard University. She has also been named an ACLS Digital Innovations Fellow for 2014-2015 in support of work on the early Caribbean Digital Archive, of which you will be hearing about today. Her work in the field of digital humanities includes projects involving text mining and mapping of early African American texts and slave narratives, digital archival work in early Caribbean texts, and work mapping the reprinting of materials in 19th century US newspapers. She is one of the founders of the award-winning Our Marathon Project, a crowdsourced archive of the Boston Marathon bombings. To her left is Nicole Algel, Associate Professor in the Department of English at Northeastern University, as well, co-director of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive at New Life for Text Maps and Networks. Her research and teaching focuses on 18th and 19th century Black Atlantic and Caribbean literatures with specializations on the slave narrative. She has published essays and chapters in the Journal of Early American Literature, African American Review, Arthurium, the Oxford Companion to African American Slave Narratives, and Teaching Anglophone Caribbean Literature. She is the author of Creole Testimonies, Slave Narratives from the British West Indies, 1709-1836, which came out of Palgrave in 2012. And she's the co-editor of Journeys of the Slave Narrative in the Early Americas, which came out from UVA Press in 2014. Currently, she is at work on a new project that examines the aesthetic translations of the neo-slave narrative genre within contemporary Caribbean cultural production. So please join me in giving a welcome to our panelists. What do I do here? Nobody told me this. Oh, the PowerPoint. Which one is it? This one?
Yes.
All right. Can
How do I know
you
when
hear us? Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
You can hear us?
Yes. Can you hear us too?
Yes, we can hear you well.
All right. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to present our project and to contribute some thoughts to the ongoing discussion on academia's adaptation to challenges and prospects raised by the internet, and that's a very important discussion, and I found the discussion yesterday already very fruitful and interesting. Let me just greet my colleague and friend Kevin Riney, who is here with me, and our colleague and friend Romain Cruz, who is on the live stream, and our photographer Romain Philippon, who is on the live stream too. So if there is no technical problems, I will just start our presentation.
Please do.
All right, thank you very much. Would you please go to the first slide for us? Thanks. The Caribbean Atlas, the website, the Caribbean Atlas, was started from the cooperation between several of the leading universities in the Caribbean region, universities of the West Indies, Université des Antilles de la Guyane, Universidad de La Habana, University Anton de Kom, and Université d'État d'Haïti. It was initially co-funded by the University of the West Indies in Mona and the Center for Research in Economics, Management, Modeling and Applied Informatics called CEREGMIA at Université des Antilles de la Guyane. The Caribbean Atlas is an online platform bringing together established Caribbeanists, young researchers, artists, and the interested community. As the three of us are trained as geographers, the project is called the Caribbean Atlas. Nevertheless, it's not an atlas in the traditional way, that means a collection of maps, but rather an online arrangement of maps, statistics, articles, and pictures. The Medium website gives us the opportunity to bring together different approaches of critical information transmission. Could you please get to the next slide? Our goals are to offer a critical approach to the perception of the Caribbean, to offer a tool for learning, teaching, and developing scientific skills. We thus want to bring together people interested in the Caribbean, artists, activists, and so on. So it's all about easy access to well-found information, and as you all might have experienced, getting quickly reliable information about Caribbean issues can be quite difficult. So we want to fill the gap between academic journals with their sometimes demanding language and online search engines or online encyclopedias where it is not always obvious how reliable these sites are. So in the present superabundance of information and analysis, one may visit the atlas and find there information and analysis that undergo a peer review process and material that is cross-referenced to the sources. So we just want to work on an academic level but present it in a more comprehensible way for daily use. Next slide, please. The Caribbean Atlas has 4 main elements, as you can see in this slide, and I will give you just a short overview and then a short tour through the website. First, what is called the Caribbean in brief. In this section, one might find statistical data like political status, population, life expectancy, and so on. Second, in the section, what it called themes, there are short, simple to read, yet academically rigorous articles. In the third section, there's a collection of contemporary and historical maps. And fourth, in collaboration with photographers and artists, we offer photo albums from different places, and soon there will be also a selection of works done by several Caribbean artists. We just are in contact with some of them, and then they will provide us with a selection of their works. Next slide, please. The goal of the Caribbean in brief is to provide a statistical overview over the Caribbean territories. So we divided the Caribbean in the islands, Central America, and in the South American coast. The categories, as you can see here, are territory and population, urbanization and migration, economy and politics, and business. What you can see here is a detail from the Caribbean islands territory and population section where we give some basic information. What we are working on right now is to link every figure to the source. Soon you'll be directed via a link to the source by clicking on the figure directly. So that's an important point for us, because the problem with statistical data in the Caribbean is that one has to look for figures and reports of national agencies or of institutions like United Nations or Inter-American Development Bank or the like. To get recent figures is quite complicated. Therefore, you often find on other websites the reference to the CIA Factbook, which is easily accessible, but unfortunately does not indicate where they get figures from. And our research indicates that their figures often differ largely from figures found in publications by national statistical services, by CARICOM, by the UN, or the like. So we want to create awareness amongst our readers towards the credibility of figures, and sure, this approach is quite labor intensive, but we think it is important being as transparent and correct as possible. So next slide, please. One of the key elements of the Caribbean Atlas are its articles. There are 10 themes which we would like to cover over time. At the moment, there are articles in 3 sections. So what is the Caribbean? We have 31 articles in English, French, or Spanish. Colonization and control, there we have 24 articles in English and French. And on physical geography and natural resources, at the moment, we just have 11 in French. So next slide, please. just a quick glimpse into the theme, what is the Caribbean? Here you can see a list of the available articles with a preview, and thanks to our broad scientific committee, we are able to realize a double-blind peer review process. There's also the possibility to add pictures, maps, or graphs to the text. So this is one of the huge advantages of working with a website where space is not limited. Giving people who want to work with the texts the opportunity to do so, one may find the articles attached as a PDF below. So next slide. That's an example for our short, simple to read, yet academically rigorous articles. You're interested in, for instance, the history of maroons, you go to the website and there you'll find a 3-page long good read article by a renowned scholar using few references. So just as an example. Next slide, please. Maps are important for geographers, and they are an important tool for learning and, for instance, also for analyzing geopolitics. As you can see on the left-hand side, there's a selection of maps spanning physical geography, population, economy and politics, and so on. On the next slide, we have 2 examples. More classical maps like the one on the left-hand side showing the CARICOM, or other thematic maps like the one on the right-hand side showcasing Beijing's perspective on the Caribbean, indicating, for example, which territories recognize Taiwan, Chinese foreign direct investments, examples of Chinese finance projects, and so on. So in this map section we have a broad range of themes covered. And last but not least, on the next slide, the photo albums. So there are series on Cuba, the Windward Islands, Guyana, Haiti, and Suriname. So on the next slide, you have 2 examples out of the series shot this year in Cap-Haïtien at the Haitian North Coast by Romain Philippon, who also provided us with the pictures you can see in the background of the website. He's quite talented, and you'll find his personal website on the address too, so just perhaps you might check this out too if you want. The attention to the project is growing. On the next slide you can see in the chart that at the moment we have about 100 hits per day. This is not much, and we believe that there is a larger audience out there which just doesn't know yet the website. And to be in time, I come to the conclusion. The Caribbean Atlas Project is the attempt to provide a source for information between search engines, Wikipedia, blogs, and scientific journals. So it is on the one hand open, that means free access and the possibility to contribute, and on the other hand it's monitored to ensure a scientific standard. So it benefits from the advantages of the internet, like quick and easy updating, accessibility, no space limitation, broad range of application. I actually use it in my course this term, and the students' response is quite positive right now. And we have the possibility to include different media. So in our perspective, it bridges gaps between generations of researchers, between different disciplines, between the scientific community and the world of arts. Could you please go to the next slide? Sorry for that. That was my fault. Besides, the Atlas might serve as a platform for exchange and discussion of different perspectives from the Caribbean, from its diasporas, and from other regions. So the website is work in progress, and there's a huge list of things we still have to do and have to fix, and it literally never ends. But within these bounds of possibility, we are all working on this, the three of us, in our free time. The project evolves, and we could need funding, especially to get the articles translated. As you might have noticed, we have more articles in French than in English, and not many articles in Spanish yet. This is mostly due to the fact that the colleagues on Martinique were in the beginning keen writing articles, and right now we have no funds to get these articles translated. And this holds true too for some English articles. So therefore right now we have the unpleasant situation that there are some articles in all the three languages available, and lots of articles only available in one of the three languages. So we are happy for ideas concerning funding, and additionally for the further development we need more people contributing to the Caribbean Atlas, which leads me to our appeal on the last slide. Please visit the website and feel free to give us feedback. And very important for us, consider proposing paper for existing or upcoming themes. We are dependent on content brought to us by the interested community. So please think about proposing papers, encourage your colleagues or your students to contribute and to do so. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Are we moving into the panel here? Okay. Well, we should start with Laurent, the order that we originally had.
Can I get this back up on the screen?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, it's really wonderful to be here today, and I'm excited to be part of this, excited to be part of this event. And I'm particularly grateful to the organizers, because I think one of the things we're quickly learning is that it's, even for the digital, or maybe especially for the digital, being together and in community is probably the best way to actually learn about projects. So many projects that I'm already learning about that I didn't know about, although I could have obviously found them on the web in principle. But meeting the people behind them is inspiring. And I think there are a lot of uniting kinds of questions and concerns that bring us together. So I'm going to start actually by talking about some of the undergirding concerns or issues I've been thinking about around Caribbean digital that have been at the base of the project that I'll focus on in the second half, which is a project creating an archive of the Radio Haiti that's available to a kind of broad public. And I'll show a couple of, I'll play a few things from that archive in a minute. But I wanted to start by saying that I think that the Caribbean field is one that's incredibly well positioned actually to engage with the digital in a way that can kind of change the space of the digital and challenge in some ways how the digital is constituted. This is a field, of course, that has always been defined by methodological questions about marginalization of certain stories, the silencing of certain stories, right? The way in which certain things get lost in history. And I think that kind of has to animate our approach to the digital as well, to use the space enthusiastically and lucidly to continue the kinds of projects that Caribbeanists have long been engaged in other forms. Now, obviously, the first point is one that I think everyone will understand here, that the issues around the silencing of certain histories will continue into the digital realm, right? They don't necessarily get solved by the digital in any way. So the same problems that surround textual scholarship and silencing will kind of continue in the digital realm if we're not there in some ways to resist them. The digitization of materials is a great example here, right? You can think about, there's a kind of illusion of completeness around digitizing certain materials, but of course some things are obsessively digitized, like everything Thomas Jefferson ever wrote, including a letter for whatever, And then meanwhile, if you look at just, for instance, what's digitized around the Haitian Revolution or the writings of figures like Toussaint or Dessalines, much less, right? Much more difficult to access. So there's kind of clear differentiation there. Obviously, we need to think about the very kind of processes that Michel Rolfe-Triot analyzed in terms of how things get silenced, and maybe add the way in which silencing happens in the digital realm to our analysis of the dynamics of power, inclusion, and silencing. So I think for the Caribbean digital, we need to be aware of the ways that it's easy for things just to create new layers of silencing, right? And the danger is a little bit, I think, serious in part because of the question of language in particular. There's a kind of phenomenon in which, right, the things that become visible digitally become the reality, and so certain languages and certain stories get left out. One of the things I think we'll be talking about a lot in the next days is how do we cultivate spaces for linguistic diversity on the web, right? How do we create a digital space of linguistic diversity? And the project I'll be talking about particularly is about creating a space for Creole in the kind of digital realm. Now, I don't think any of this obviously should discourage us, but rather motivate us. The other side of the coin is that the digital probably allows us to think proactively and creatively about potential future silences, right? And sort of think in a future-oriented way about what might be silenced or could be silenced that instead could be made visible in the future. We could be kind of digital militants, kind of trying to project and imagine a different kind of future for scholarship as well. Now, the new technologies in particular obviously engage us, force us, I think, to think about the connection with broader publics, right? And that's one of the most important realms in this. The possibility of sharing material through digital work, not just through blogs and social media, but also through really giving access to the archive, right, or opening up the archive to broader audiences, and using multimedia presentation to do so, maps and so forth, like in fact, like the Caribbean Atlas does, is, I think, very important. And I do think that the field of Caribbean studies is actually perhaps really well suited to think about using those kind of different forms, right? The sound, the visual, and making those things available to a broader audience. Of course, putting things online does not really necessarily make them accessible, right? They're accessible in principle, but not necessarily in practice. And so obviously the whole question of kind of style and content and how we make things that will actually be receivable and communicatable to the audience we wish to reach is itself a whole task that we have to take up. So grappling with style, composition, and reach as an active project, I think, is critical to what we're going to do. So I think just taking on the digital in the same way that we've taken on other forms of communication, of writing, as a space of critique and exchange, and to learn how things do work well there, is critical as well. Now, obviously, and I've already mentioned this, what the digital does offer beautifully is an opportunity to use the non-textual materials in relationship to text, right? To make the visual and the sonic present in a way that we just can't in our books, right? We've often wanted to in our books, but can't. And that is really exciting, and I think particularly important. And I think, so hopefully what I'll talk about here with regards to the Radio Haiti archive are things that can be broadened out to other people who I know are experimenting with the same kinds of issues as well. So let me talk a little bit about the background of this project. I hope that to kind of use it as an example again of what sound in particular and language can be in the realm of the digital. So the background of this project, many of you are probably familiar with the history of Radio Haiti. This was a radio station that from the late 1970s to the early 200s was a kind of foundational voice for democracy in Haiti. One of the first to really broadcast in Creole, reported on the pro-democracy movements. It's chronicled in Jonathan Demme's movie, The Agronomist, which many of you have probably seen. And in that film, if you've seen it, there's parts of the radio archive are kind of in that film. Created by Jean Dominique, Michel Montas was central also to its history, and I'll talk about her in a moment. A lot of it, what's critical about this archive is that there's a tremendous amount of reporting from the countryside on peasant movements, from urban movements. They had a level of trust within Haitian communities that allowed them to get in where other radio stations weren't. And so there's a kind of archive there of this experience. Now, they recorded all their shows on reel-to-reel tapes and later cassette tapes while they were broadcasting them. I'll talk about the difficulties of that, because actually what they often did was they got reels from European radio stations of news that they played, and then they recorded over that 3 or 4 tracks of going back and forth because they never had enough tapes. So untangling that is a kind of interesting process. I'll say, though, that because of the history of the radio station, I would argue this is one of the most important archives we have for the history of Haiti from the 1980s to the 2000s, right? An archive that actually gets into kind of popular voices. It's not a state-produced archive. It's an archive that was driven by a kind of commitment to popular democracy and grassroots activism. And so many voices are there that are not present elsewhere. But also, it's unique in the sense that it's a largely Creole archive. It's Creole and French. But it is an archive that's almost entirely in the two languages of Haiti, a lot of it in Creole. And of course, it's an audio archive, which means that it's accessible in different ways. Now, the tapes have an incredible story. The radio station was actually shut down right after Reagan was elected in the 1980s. They came and shot up the radio station. Jean-Dominique and Michel fled. They were out of the country for 6 years. The army kind of busted up the radio station and broke all the equipment, but left all the tapes that had been made in a little storage area. They survived, although the building was kind of open. They survived for 6 years, and when they came back, they just kind of opened the drawer, and there were their tapes. And they would sometimes rebroadcast their old things. Then they created, obviously, new tapes through the 90s and late 80s and 90s. So it's kind of a remarkable testament in some ways to the survival of this, that the army did not think to destroy the archive itself at that moment. So, after Jean-Dominique was assassinated in 2000, Montas continued the radio station for a few years, ultimately stopped, carried all the tapes with her to her homes in the United States, and had been searching for a place to deposit them for some time, and ultimately decided to donate them to Duke, in part because we have a human rights library, a human rights archive there, which had already brought in the National Coalition for Haitian Refugees archive, which is a great archive about the Haitian diaspora. There was the Haiti lab there at the time, and a kind of institutional commitment to Haitian studies that was prevalent. Now, Montas wanted the materials preserved, obviously, but she also is very intent on a kind of immediate project, which was to make them available relatively quickly, or as quickly as possible, to an audience that she considered was interested, that she, I think, rightly considered was, which is an audience in Haiti of people interested in the history of the democracy movement, as well as the history of the Duvalier dictatorship in the years afterwards. You know, this archive documents all of that. Montas, like, you know, in many cases, Montas had a desire to have the archive housed in Haiti, couldn't think of an institutional location that could have the capacity to digitize them. And so to some extent, the goal here is to kind of create a digital archive of them that will then be housed on the web, but also housed in sort of locations like Focal and other places in Haiti on hard drives and computers there. So there will be sort of repositories as well. But the key in particular is that we're trying to make a space where people can essentially download these as podcasts or as MP3s, sort of the ideal being that people can listen to them on smartphones or whatever else in relatively small file sizes. There's been technical challenges. I won't go into them, but just dealing with these tapes and kind of pulling the material off of them, figuring out when it's de Gaulle speaking from the French, or there's these kind of tapes that come in, older tapes. But also just kind of saving the tapes and putting them into the digital realm is just a large process that the Duke Library has committed to. They've applied for an NEH grant for it as well. There's mold disintegration, you can kind of imagine. But there's an amazing team at Duke kind of pulling the material out. So far, we've digitized just 30 shows. There's 3,000 tapes, so it's a really big archive. And we've just sort of selectively started using those to build this website. I'll say just, before I kind of go into showing the site, just that I think many of the questions that often surround the digital are quite clear here in a way, actually. We've been lucky in that sense. The kind of scholarly importance of the collection is quite clear in terms of understanding late 20th century Haitian history. There is a clear public audience beyond the university, and the level of kind of interest in this project that we've had in Haiti is really amazing in a sense, because people who lived through this generation, many people remember the radio station, remember specific broadcasts, remember hearing them at a certain moment. So there's a very live memory of this archive, and people would like to hear them again. A few of the challenges that we have had, one is just an institutional, it's not really like a conflict, but it's a difference between the special collections library ethos, right, which has a like longue durée vision, which is in 100 years these need to be preserved, right? So there's a sense of like, right now we need to save these materials, make them available for the future, and then the kind of feeling of immediacy that Michelle and others of us have that this material needs to, there are actually people waiting for this stuff kind of now, and that is a little bit, that's, just negotiating that. And the way we've kind of handled that is that, so the center that I run, Forum for Scholars and Publics, has basically taken on the task of, as we can get the materials from the library, dealing with the kind of public interface and making things available. We have Laura Wagner, who's a doctoral student from UNC, who recently finished a PhD, has been working on the project, listening to the tapes, writing descriptions of them in Creole, and I'll start showing you the site in a minute, as well as the library staff. So, a couple decisions we made just about the site. First of all, we just wanted the sound basically we're foregrounding two things, which is sound and Creole, right? So sort of the first things you'll see, things are in Creole and things are kind of organized basically according to seeing the recordings. We're still experimenting this, and we're happy to get suggestions. We're using a mix of SoundCloud and then just downloadable MP3 formats. So the idea is that you could, I mean, our idea is that for many people, we'll just get on the site and want to just get the sound and download it and then deal with stuff later. But the titles are in Creole here, you can see, and then we have a kind of smaller subtitle in English, and then a description in Creole, and then below that a description in English. One of the main challenges, and I hope we can discuss this a bit, is just the lack of bilingual platforms, or really easy to use bilingual platforms in the digital space. It's not that there's nothing, but it turns out to be a really interesting bind, trying to build sites that are bilingual or trilingual in a way that doesn't take a huge amount of work. So we've solved that partly by just making Creole first and English afterwards. But perhaps we can think collectively about how, I mean, with designers and so forth, I'm sure these things could be designed, but there hasn't been enough of an emphasis, I think, on the need for truly multilingual platforms that can also be open. This is a WordPress platform, so. We hope ultimately to incorporate French, but not right now. We decided to do Creole and English. Now let me just end by using a couple recordings and think about what it means to hear, like what it means to actually hear these recordings and how that operates. I'll take as an example a couple of tapes around events that happened in Jean Rabel in 1987. So this is kind of part of the whole course of history after the overthrow of Duvalier in 1986, the attempt of grassroots organizations to kind of anchor democracy in Haiti, the continuing military struggles and so forth. So an amazing, kind of incredible moment in which the movement that had overthrown Duvalier was still struggling to kind of anchor democracy in Haiti. And we've kind of chosen to collect a few recordings around there. One of the things that is kind of striking about this is sometimes you can hear these recordings and it's almost, it could be a recording you're hearing on the news today, right? There's a kind of immediacy to listening to some of these things. And I'll just play one of here that kind of... I'll play this and explain a little bit more of the context.
Même si mourir fini révolution, nan fik pour marcher, pour nous garder ça nous la liberté, vie, travail, honnêteté, pour nous garder homme demain. Voilà notre déclaration d'avoir fait.
So this is just like a little tiny piece of an interview with a man who was in a protest and was shot and was being interviewed, sort of bleeding from his arm. The first thing he says is like, even if we die, we're going to finish this revolution, right? That's his sort of first. And then they continue, and he explains that he was at a demonstration, that an auxiliary came and shot him in the arm. And there's a whole series of these that are kind of street-level kind of dialogues. And again, what's often really amazing about these is you get a combination of, right, just reporting from the streets, but you'll hear people's voices and their sense of what they're doing at this particular moment in history, kind of coming through. Then a second example that I'll end with here of a man named Father Jean-Marie Vincent, who is one of the liberation theology priests who had kind of really worked closely with rural communities. Went to Jean Rabel at this time, and this is a really long interview that Michel Montas did with him. It's a really remarkable interview for a couple of reasons. One, it just kind of lays out, again, these are kind of experiences of activism that we're familiar with in a broad sense, that priests and communities work together to kind of define a sense of democracy in Haiti. But here you really have a lot of intricate sense of how that works and how this particular individual thought of it at some length. So I'll play just a brief moment of this interview, give you a sense of it.
Est-ce que le groupement communautaire est ensemble à craser pour ça? Moi, pas quoi. Moi, pas quoi ça. Moi, crois que pas aucun peuple qui accepte les chaînes jusqu'à la fin. Solution au pays d'Haïti, pas capable de passer à travers l'autre bagaille que l'organisation peuple à lui-même. C'est pour ça que nous-mêmes, l'entête ensemble, Jean Rabel, nous pas jamais fait discussion directement politique et idéologique. C'est pour ça que nous pas quoi un candidat pour changer la situation au pays d'Haïti, nous quoi seulement l'organisation peuple là pour choix démocratique que le bras le fait puis devant. Bon, est-ce que coup ça que peuple là prend que chrétien?
So this is a place where he kind of saying, right, he's talking about all the work that has been done to try to crush these organizations, and he's saying, these organizations are going to continue, people never accept their chains. But then he talks about also how the point is not actually to sort of go for particular candidates, but rather to kind of build an infrastructure of democratic practice and participation. Now, this tape, it turns out, was kind of a nice kind of confirmation of what we hope to do with this project. There's a way in which just hearing these voices, right, are kind of coming, returning, are kind of monument to these particular individuals. Jean-Marie Vincent was assassinated in 1994, and recently Focal, this past August, did an event commemorating the 10th year anniversary of his death in August. And we had heard about this, and they asked us whether there were tapes in Radio Haiti of his speaking. It turns out, I think this is the only recording, actually, of a long recording with him. And so the recording was able to be played. It was actually played in its entirety at this Focal event, so people could kind of hear him again and kind of hear this interpretation. So that, again, it helps us go back to the libraries, too, and confirm that, again, there's a kind of urgency to some of this, obviously in the context of just remembering these years, of thinking about Duvalier, of potential trials and so forth. So we're already seeing the recordings starting to travel. The ambition is to create a space, too, where Radio Haiti will be kind of live and will live in the kind of long term, and it will continue to be on the air, in a sense. That's kind of the idea that Michel has, which is like this radio station can still be on air in a certain sense and be used. The ways the broadcast can be brought down onto computers and phones, listened to in groups, rebroadcast on the radio, and for all of this to help contribute to the never-finished discussion of the future of democracy in Haiti. Thank you.
That's a perfect presentation. 20 minutes.
Take my phone back.
Good morning. I will try and get through here quickly in 20 minutes. I have three things that I'd like to cover today, three topics. One is the digital divide, that the great discrepancies that we have with the access to technology and research collections. The second is a consideration of the Caribbean geographies, which I will call the West Atlantic Valley, given the location of databases and technology scholars and populations of the Caribbean diaspora. And the third is the flotsam, a word that I've chosen that sounds nicer than what one could otherwise call the poorly edited and self-published literature, under quotes, and misinformed, plagiarized, and noisy critical chatter that overwhelms cyberspace. My focus is especially the French and Creole-speaking islands, Haiti in particular, because that's the area that I know best. Yet many of my examples apply not only to the rest of the Caribbean, but to global publishing and criticism in the age of the internet. We all know that there's astounding disparities in access to the physical collections and to online archives. These disparities exist not only between different island nations, but within such economically disparate societies as the United States. There are also enormous contrasts between nations and cultures when examining the percentage of their literary patrimony that has been physically preserved and digitized. The advent of the internet was seen by many as a means to bridge these gaps, where immense databases continue to become available, offering access to material and collections that would never otherwise have been able to be purchased or made physically available. When considering this digital divide, I was convinced I'd speak today with a continuing note of frustration at these inequalities. Some 20 years after the advent of the graphical interface of the internet, however, I feel a bit more optimistic. For one, internet speed is not everything, but even so, the slow speeds on such large islands as Cuba, because of the US policies, and those of other nations, especially islands, where underwater cables, fiber optic or not, are located at a great distance from high-speed hubs, they're gradually diminishing, and other possibilities of satellite connectivity can now be found even in remote areas, offering better access and often at acceptable speeds. Improvements everywhere are unquestionably on the horizon. Without knowing in detail the realities of each Caribbean island, I would like to suggest some contrast in digital collections and access to the general public between state and private collections and those housed by religious and secular institutions. France, for example, once a leader with its universal Minitel of the 1980s, fell far behind in the early years of the personal computer and the advent of the internet. With state funding, however, French national and regional collections are becoming more accessible, and funding has been made available to digitize increasing amounts of historical archives. Let me see if I can pull up some things here. For example, you know, the Conseil Régional of Martinique, they have the Archive départementale. You can look under the culture section there and see many things. And the Banque numérique du patrimoine martiniquais, where we have such regional and public archives that include judicial, administrative information, and there are plans to develop the archives of Martinique's immaterial and cultural patrimony. And this is not here developed yet. But by contrast, in Haiti, with a far poorer and weaker state structure, it is the Catholic repositories that have preserved the physical archive from destruction, especially during the years of the dictatorship, and have been a major part of efforts to digitize and disseminate these archives for future generations. Of the three Bibliothèques du Patrimoine, the patrimonial libraries in Haiti, there's the Bibliothèque Nationale of Haiti, and then the two others are Catholic institutions, the Bibliothèque Haïtienne des Frères de l'Instruction Publique at the School of Saint-Louis de Gonzague, and the Bibliothèque Haïtienne des Pères de Saint-Esprit. In 2006, I presented a project to the NEH to digitize a number of century-old Haitian periodicals. And although this project was not funded, it was an excuse to take an inventory of the pressing needs of preservation of Haiti's precious archive. Patrick Tardieu, who you see here, of the Bibliothèque Haïtienne des Pères du Saint-Esprit, was not part of this project because their archive is much older. It includes one of the richest collections of the history of Caribbean slavery in the world, and he's done a lot of digitization himself, including the Haitian Civil Code in conditions that I can illustrate with some of these photos. And this one I like in particular, where you see him supporting the burned out hard drive he has. He's got a fan that gets hooked up to it. But he's received some small funding, and so has the Bibliothèque Nationale in Haiti, especially since the earthquake of 2010. And just for the background, is the Bibliothèque Nationale of Haiti was reopened in the later years of Baby Doc in 1981, and at that point there was no roof and there were no books. And so over the years, collections have been added, things that were hidden during the dictatorship. They added the collection of the Haitian Army when it was disbanded. And, you know, just to show you a few pictures of the physical needs. When you see now, I mean, now electricity is a little better in the library, but when you see the conditions in which this physical archive is disintegrating, but things are getting a little better. They're working right now to digitize a lot of the Haitian patrimony, especially works that are in the public domain. They will be launching their website soon. They've got the National Bibliography of 2008-2012 already prepared. And they've been working with other libraries, such as the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, to be able to use some of the Haitian archive that's been used elsewhere that's already been digitized. But when you see, you know, the consultation conditions where people are ripping up things when they are using them there, and I just to finish there for all of us in a different context is to show you some of the things after the earthquake, which is something else. Jean-Ufel-Milsey, who's the president of PEN Haiti, was working at the Ministère des Affaires étrangères, which was one of the buildings that came down in the earthquake. And this is a 200-year-old archive of their foreign affairs. And the woman who was the minister at the point just said, let's just bulldoze it. And he and others saved some 600 square meters of documents from destruction. And if you can see the condition of these things and the amount of work that needs to be done, it's pretty amazing. But anyway, these are just two examples, you know, Martinique and Haiti. But they can be replicated in contrast even in the United States, where public funding is often meager for the preservation of our own history. An example is the destruction of much of our regional newspapers that were microfilmed in the 1960s, and then the originals were all thrown out. And these days, those microfilms can't even be read for OCR scanning. In the US, we see wealthy private collections, such as those of private universities and libraries funded by private foundations and grants, but rarely is there a concern for wide access and dissemination of this material. As we know, there's no public education structure in the US, but in this country, it's always the maximum opportunities for the few with some trickle-down effects to the public institutions. National organizations such as the NEH are less wealthy than their private counterparts, and perhaps naturally the NEH grants are rarely available for collections that are not in English, nor directly concern the U.S. The U.S. International organizations such as the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, they set their priorities much more on political and economic concerns than on culture. And with their 2 large Haussmannian buildings in France, they're much more concerned with having receptions and cocktail parties than financing cultural projects. Yet, some projects are funded, and some by such well-endowed universities as Duke, as you just heard from Laurent Dubois, that are performing an excellent service by preserving and digitizing the collections of Radio IT Inter. And this is something I've followed for the years with Gigi, in the radio, soon after the assassination of Jean-Dominique. And it's been a concern. This is in the studios before they closed. The accessibility. I think Laurent spoke enough about this, but I say bravo to Duke. And I'm speaking from the perspective of a public university, CUNY, that lacks such institutional support structures. And I don't have time today, and this is not the topic of my speech, to talk about e-learning, but it's something I've been doing now for over 16 years. I started in 1998, and I have absolutely no support. And I am in a public institution, and I do not get this. But just for what it is, it's a huge database of authors, bibliographies from the different islands, including the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific. And I have an enormous database that includes a lot of audio. The audio is all in reel format. I don't have the funding to switch this, but I have a 20-year enormous archive in audio that's on reel format, if someone ever would finance something to move it more modern. And I've done interviews of some 100 authors on video. There's also work that I've been doing with some preservation of old things. Jean-François Chalut did some incredible filming in 1992 in Haiti under conditions that are quite impossible, and he digitized his Betamax things, and I've been editing them, and this is especially a number of authors who are no longer with us, and these all have closed caption titles there, but it's some of the work that I've been doing that isn't my main concern. But as I say, it's I've had problems working in French in the United States to get funding, and I think it's not irrelevant to our Pan-Caribbean studies to see these weird and odd linguistic and colonial chains that to distant lands that are closer than these local geographic and cultural cousins. So there's barriers that hopefully we can get over that's part of this digital divide that, as I noted, is global with pockets of richness and poverty everywhere. There are many promising signs, however, and the MLA, for example, has at one point I served on their digital technology committee, and they've always had a policy to make sure that scholars working in cultures make their research available to the communities studied. And it has helped countries such as Haiti, where today at the Université d'État d'Haïti on the campus in Port-au-Prince, students and faculty have free access to the MLA bibliography through JSTOR, offering many of the books and journals that are published there. But here again, of course, there's problems of resources that are not necessarily available. These are not available elsewhere in Haiti. And the faculty themselves are not necessarily familiar with this. And there's physical constraints, of course, of electricity, computers, and internet connections. And for many of the students, the problem is a lot of our scholarship is in English. So they can't read a lot of what we're doing. But just to conclude there is, the digital divide is, I just wanted to laud the work of Brooke Woodridge with the Digital Library of the Caribbean, which I'll get to, but I think, again, I want to underline that the difference between the state and private collections, which are not necessarily different in the digital age than they were in the analog world, where problems of access include that of dissemination, which again, reminds us of those geopolitical walls that prevent work, such an excellent work of the Casa de las Americas in Cuba that's done wonderful work promoting, publishing, and translating works that other people are simply not aware of. So my second point is very quick, which is this notion of the West Atlantic Valley, if you want to look at it kind of like the Silicon Valley, that I think that our work in the Caribbean, this is where we stand from. This zone of working in Caribbean is really going from Quebec down to the Guyanas. If you go from Montreal to Cayenne, you have really, the most interesting people working in scholarship. It's not that it doesn't exist elsewhere in Europe in certain pockets, such as Liverpool or Amsterdam, but I would argue that our fields of scholarship, cultural studies, post-colonial studies, interdisciplinary studies, gender studies, for example, have flourished much more in this West Atlantic Valley or corridor than in Europe or Africa, often because of weak institutional support for such fields in the European academy and because of inadequate infrastructural support in Africa. But with the question with internet speed and the large diasporas from most of the Caribbean islands, I think that Miami symbolically seems to be this hub of this West Atlantic Valley, kind of like in Russell Banks' Continental Drifts, where Florida is this fertile meeting place and a hub of the Caribbean imaginary. Here we could return again to the work of the Digital Library of the Caribbean, housed in Miami, but only insofar as its human editors and physical servers are located there. Our conference taking place here in this island of Manhattan is inextricably linked to this valley, but I think it behooves us to encourage the dissemination of New World scholarship elsewhere in all the Caribbean languages and including across the Atlantic. So the buzz and the flotsam. When I refer to the masses of junk that proliferate on the internet as flotsam, I'm speaking of this space of anarchical half-truths and distorted documentation, badly written text often comprised of poorly cut and pasted text without editorial oversight, and the buzz of social network chatter. We now function in the world of ubiquitous Wikipedias, endless online plagiarism, biased blogs, unpaid and uncorrected journalists, a world with disappearing bookstores, as well as publishing and editorial structures, and where there has been a proliferation of self-publishing. We've all become accustomed to reading Wikipedia pages as they often appear as the first link with online searches. Many are exceptionally detailed and factual, but it is imperative to consult other sources when seeking reliably verifiable information. When I ask my students never to cite Wikipedia, I give as the example that they could go online and confirm that Toussaint Louverture was a Japanese transvestite. You never know, An entry can be vary enormously in its presentation in the Wikipedia pages in French, Creole, Spanish, and English. And I found many pages from Il en Ile that have been copied, translated, and pasted into Wikipedia sites in Creole and in Russian without reference or links to the original authors, the text, or the complete and complementary documentation. To give a precise example of this sort of internet information that one can read, on the internet, you can read, for example, on the biography of Jean-Dominique, that he was married to Michel Montas and they had 3 daughters, Gigi, Dominique, and Dolores. So, they are not Michel Montas's daughters. But it's not that Wikipedia has no editors, and the studies have shown that the Encyclopedia Britannica is not necessarily more accurate or thorough. Among the problems, however, is that such erroneous information found with online sources is often reproduced repeatedly in newspaper articles as well as on other web pages until the erroneous statements become accepted as facts. Self-publishing is hardly a new phenomenon in the Caribbean. In Caribbean literature, existing well before the internet and corporate mergers decimated traditional publishing houses. Because of poor or inexistent publishing structures in many island nations, or because of publishers from the politics of the so-called former mother countries that often excluded writers that weren't they're outside of their geographical periphery, many writers had no other choices but to self-publish. The examples that I give is L'Édition L'Harmattan in Paris that publishes 2,000 books a year. It is the largest publisher in the French language that exists, but they will publish basically anything. Many Caribbean authors that now have moved on to bigger houses, such as Maurice Condé, Raphaël Confiant, Max Jean, Yannick Lines, Ernest Pépin, they've all published with L'Harmattan, and yet many authors, they don't even want that limited editorial structure that L'Harmattan has, and they prefer to publish themselves. And examples that I can give in Haiti is Christophe Charles and Franck Etienne, and in Martinique, Tony Delcham. Very successful. One of the advantages there, of course, is their publications are available at a reasonable price for their local communities, which is not the case when these offshore publications come back to the islands. With the endless consolidation of book publishers, it's become more difficult not only to publish, but to publish with a company that has editorial staff that will review works prior to publication. As book publishing moves online, there are many examples that give reason to worry. The Huffington Post is an example. In journalism, to say nothing of grammar, I speak of the cutting and pasting of or simply linking to information and other news sources, their policy of not paying their journalist contributors, whose errors and falsehoods are corrected only in the Chatterbox online commentary. Spotify is the example for streaming services for musicians. So clearly online self-publishing is filling a niche that is necessary. In French, you have Manuscrit, there's Smashwords, Uscribe, and I think the bigger players are well known, Amazon's Kindle Direct and Apple's iBooks Author. It's similar to, some of these have paper services as well, but I say it's not really that different from what used to be Kinko's, that you just simply go off and print your own books. And I guess when you have editors disappear, you kind of wonder, we need to remind ourselves why the editors exist. In Haiti, for example, you have very few legitimate publication editors, and most Haitian authors self-publish with one single printer, l'imprimeur deux. The physical quality of these texts is very cheap, but again, not expensive. There's no editorial oversight to correct typographical and grammatical errors, contradictions and inconsistencies in characters and plots, and other weaknesses of style that could have been improved had a real editor reworked the text with the author. This does not mean that real editors in Haiti, such as the Presse Nationale or in the journal Le Nouveliste, themselves correct such errors, but one used to be accompanied to know certain editors and newspapers that had reputable editors and publishers. So I need to finish here. I think publication in any format, once it's out, there's a question of marketing afterwards. And so when we speak of the digital Caribbean in our digital world, we're looking for these kind of how these things are disseminated, and obviously it's through online blogs and things, and I think now it's all just buzz. And the example that I use is Tina Brown, who at one point was the editor of The New Yorker and Vanity Fair, but she's leaving at the end of this year, the head of the Daily Beast, under which she oversaw the death of the 75-year-old magazine Newsweek. But in an article on her, Rem Ryder says that the Daily Beast used Huffington Post as an example. It was a template for the Beast with its mix of rampant aggregation of everybody else's material, some original content, and lots of attitude. And so with new journalism's priority given to buzz, noise, and attitude, so it goes with book publishing. And as we see all the chatter online with Facebook, Twitter, and all the rest, I just wanted to give one quick example of Marguerite Papillon. One day you wake up and you see on your Facebook page that there's this affair, plagiarism, blah, blah. And Marguerite Papillon self-publishes except for her first two works. But now she does her own work with Butterfly Editions, which is Amazon's Create Space. And she's accused Kathleen Mouse of plagiarizing her. And the thing that's really funny about Papillon's stuff she sends all over the internet is she includes the letter from Mercure de France that responded seriously to her accusations, showing that her accusations are entirely unfounded.
We could probably take this in the question and answer.
Okay, let me finish up here then. But it's like for me, when you go online now and you go to Amazon.com and you search Ketley Mouse, and you come up with, on your first searches, you come up with Marguerite Papillon. It's, this obnoxious and envious writer who's out there making space there. So, it's my kind of question is what kind of material proliferates on the internet now with the blogs and the new media, self-promotion, hastily argued and unedited works of both journalism and literature. I think, with all these Facebook tags and likes and tweets and the discussion forums, it's important for us as scholars and writers and teachers not only to be, show those that are the reliable databases, but also, and to make the resources available to everyone, but yes, support open source, reliable databases, respect of copyright ownership, but we need some filters. We need some filters to sort the wheat from the chaff. So thank you.
You almost defeated me there. That was great.
How's everybody doing? All right. My presentation today is based on a project called Museum of the Caribbean Diaspora, and it's an area of interest because of people that I run across in different places, and somehow, without physically recognizing they're from the Caribbean, you end up hearing an accent and a conversation starts. And it's happened in a variety of places. I live in Washington, D.C., and very actively involved in the local community. And the chief technology officer had a forum for people interested in the digital space. And within that forum, I got a chance to meet folks that were doing some open source projects through George Mason, and also from the D.C. Humanities Council. And we began talking about this idea of them funding programs and the digital, and converting the physical projects that they funded into digital pieces. So they would have pamphlets, they would have video, and after the grants were funded, the projects would just disappear. So they partnered with George Mason to do this project through Omeka, which is an open source platform to capture the grant projects that they funded so they can have a record of it over a period of time. Then I started thinking about my interest in research in terms of the Caribbean diaspora and where we are and how we meet each other and how we pass each other along the way. So I thought of this idea to come up with this repository to collect artifacts, digitized documents, videos, music, and audio formats. And the grant was a small initial seed grant of $2,000. And I figured I can do something with that to just get started and then see where it went from there. And as I mentioned, the Omeka platform is similar to like WordPress or Drupal, where you have this open source program, and people then craft themselves into developers, and they can shift and make images and turn it into some beautiful web pages and websites. And they give you some standard platforms. Mine right now is just a basic platform, but University of Minnesota digitized a bunch of their old athletic programs and archives and photographs. So it's a very flexible platform, and it's used by library, museum, archive, archivists in schools, and so forth and so on. So for the purpose of this project, I use a oral history method, but I would consider it to be more interdisciplinary because I went, videotaped, came up with a format, a script, and put together this piece where I conducted some preliminary research based on people that I knew, people who were maybe more prominent, in the community in the Washington, D.C. area, so folks will be able to connect with them. And then from there, created like a research design, wrote up a treatment, which is from a communication standpoint, what kind of questions we're going to ask, how is it going to be formatted, and at the end, how or where we're going to do the interview, how it's going to be conducted. Keeping in mind that once the final project is finished, you can do different things with it. So always wanted to make sure we had all those elements in thought as we actually move forward with the interviews. So the first thing was, coming up with a central question and issue. And the grant was based on local communities in Washington, D.C. So they've always looked at historical LaJoy Park, Deanwood, some of these areas where some of the luminaries from Washington, D.C. created Duke Ellington and places and folks like that. So I wanted to look at the Caribbean contribution of people to the Washington, D.C. area and to the community. So I started thinking about that. I started thinking about the different wards in Washington, D.C. Next was the planning the project, how it was going to play out, and considering what the end product was going to be. What can you do with it after you finish with it? The budget, which was, again, a small budget of $2,000, where you're going to be able to publicize it, evaluate it. What type of personnel would you need? Can you shoot it yourself and make sure you have a quality product? Do you need to hire a video person, an audio person, which obviously ties into the budget and the type of equipment that you needed, and then the time frames in which you needed to get it done by. And then the next part of it was how do you go about conducting your initial research and your background and make sure you identify some key people. So during the research design, we looked at doing interviews, the process of doing the interviews, evaluating the interviews, and then going back to step one, interviewing some folks again, organizing the results, and then how do you store this material? Right now, everything is digitized through some chips, or you have an SD card, so you have it on that platform, but then it has to go to a server somewhere and be housed somewhere. Where is that going to be housed? Or do you have the capacity as you capture more and more data to store it someplace? So those are the things you would think about long term. So in terms of the end product, I know the panel yesterday talked about teaching students how to work with archival materials. So what can that end product be? You can use it for video documentary purpose, PowerPoints, NPR-style broadcasts. Generally, when NPR goes out and they do a story about a particular community, a segment, they have these interviews, and sometimes they need to pull sources that are authentic. Where can those sources come from? You can do interactive exhibitions, photo essays that are kind of driven by the images that you capture or the information that you get, non-traditional research papers and interview booklets or newspapers that you can actually collaborate with. Again, going back to the population, so I came up with this idea looked into this concept of snowball sampling. So if we looked around the room now, you can look at any of us and say where we're from, right? But if I was to identify one person from the Caribbean, they would be able to tell me about somebody else, and they'd be able to tell me about somebody else. And it's almost like that commercial where he told a friend and so on and so on and so on. You remember that commercial, right? So it's the same thing. You identify somebody, and they say, hey, I say I'm from St. Vincent. I say, well, I have a friend from St. Vincent. And then they put you in contact with that friend, and then you get into a network where you have access to a variety of people from different backgrounds. So that's kind of what happened with this process. I got in contact with one person, they put me in contact with another person, and before you know it, I had a list of people that I could potentially interview for this program, this project. But ultimately, it came down to availability, schedule, timing, and the amount of resources you have. With $2,000, I couldn't interview 30 people. So I kind of had to narrow it down and focus on certain things. And when it came down to it, whoever was available ultimately was a deciding factor within the time frame of the requirements of the grant and the end product. So some sample questions from an oral history standpoint. I wanted to kind of dig deeper into who these folks were, what kind of drove them, what motivated them. So I started off with some questions about grandparents, great-grandparents. Do you know them? Did you know, do you remember any stories that you can tell? Do you know where they're from? And a lot of folks did, right? So you have somebody who may have been from Guyana, but their folks came from Barbados, or they went from Dominica to Guyana to work. Some people, yesterday we talked a lot about the Panama Canal. A lot of folks went from Jamaica, Dominica, and Barbados to the Panama Canal. So those generational roots. Do they remember anything about their childhood, any family traditions that may have stuck with them and kind of continued to be relevant in their day-to-day life, right? Their hometown. How did you, migration and immigration, how did you come to this country? Why did you come to the country? Do you remember when you came up? Anything that stood out in your mind? So all these kind of probing questions produce a variety of answers from the people being interviewed. So just to give you a snapshot of some of my interviewees. Jaye Lynch from Trinidad, his mother's from Colombia, but in the 1996 Olympics, he was a silver medalist in gymnastics. He's now living in Washington, D.C., and he's a real estate developer, developing the U Street area, if you guys are familiar with Washington, D.C., which is once a dilapidated area, but it's very up and coming, it's thriving. There's a Trader Joe's, there are developments all over the place, right? So he's one of the major people behind that. And when I interviewed him, I asked him, how did you end up from being an Olympic gymnast to development? And he said, well, that was always part of the plan. He went to Stanford. He had a background in engineering and real estate management, but Olympics and the things he did was just a process to get to where he ultimately wanted to be, which was what he's doing now. Vaughn Martin is a person who runs a program called Caribbeana, and he's been on the air since 1976, I think 40 years. And he's documented just about everything radio-wise, interview-wise, that happened in the Washington, D.C. area through his program. So one of the questions I asked him about maybe his most memorable interviews, and he said one of his most memorable interviews was with Michael Manley, which was one of the last interviews he gave before he passed away. He was in the hotel, and he didn't really want to do it, and ultimately he came out and do it, and the interview turned out great. Had some great discourse, talked about a variety of things, but he captured that interview, and he has it. In addition to that, he has photographs. So you have a 40-year period of images and recordings and interviews of people that passed through this particular area, right? Kojo Nnamdi is a well-known radio host here in Washington, D.C. He's originally from Guyana. Talking to him, he grew up in between a rum shop and a distillery. And he was in his 20s, just selling insurance, having a good time. His mother said, well, you're not gonna stay here. So she bought him a ticket, sent him off to school in Canada. He ended up coming to New York trying to become a Broadway actor, and ultimately went to Washington, D.C. Because of this federal college that was put together talking about black thought. So he moved to Washington, D.C. He has C Speer, Lockhart, Neil Albert from Guyana. He was the deputy mayor for economic development during the Adrian Fenty administration in Washington, D.C. Roland Roebuck is a community activist. You have Bob Ellison, who I'll go into detail about a little bit more deeper, but he's originally from St. Vincent. His family's from St. Vincent. And he was the first black president of the White House Correspondents in 1991. Right? So again, you wouldn't know that, but I came across him through having a casual conversation with somebody that was affiliated with Howard, told him what I was doing, told him I was from St. Vincent, and most of the times when I tell somebody they're from St. Vincent, they either think I'm talking about the hospital or Paris in Jamaica, right? But he knew exactly where it was. He said, do you know Bob? I said, no. He started this conversation. Bob Ellison passed away in 2010, but he put me in contact with his wife. I reached out to his wife, and she said, oh man, this is great. I have all this stuff that he did, and nobody's ever expressed an interest in what he's done, and I'm so happy. So she invited me over and gave me a bunch of stuff that I can take, digitize, and bring back to her. So these are just some images of that experience. So we had him here with the bushes, You have a snapshot of him, Sinbad, who was the host, and Colin Powell here. This is a invitation he had when the prince and the duke came to Washington, D.C., and she had a copy of the invite that was sent to him, and she let me capture that. And he wanted to actually do some research and find out about his family roots. So he actually went back home, like I did, and got a copy of a birth certificate, and he traced his lineage. Wanted to find out. His mother was from St. Vincent, and his father was from Virginia, but he wanted to find out certain aspects about his Caribbean roots. So I was able to get a copy of this, and this is not its entirety, but this is just a snapshot. I was able to get a copy of a birth certificate as well. And she gave me a variety of information verbally, which I recorded but haven't edited and transcribed. In addition to that, she has in her attic a bunch of cassette tapes of people he interviewed while as a part of the White House correspondent. They're just sitting in the attic, and she needs to get them digitized and put out. And she just wants people to know the work that he did during the time that he was involved in his press corps. So what I'd like to do right now is just show you a clip of 2 interviews that I conducted, and just to kind of see the information that was pulled out of these interviews and hear from the participants themselves. You have any audio?
My name is Roland Emerson Roebuck. I am 64 years old, and I come from St. Croix and Puerto Rico, although I was born in New York, but I do not claim New York. I lived in Ward 1 from 1974 to 2001 when I moved to Columbia Road, and I stayed there for about 5 years, and then I've been in this ward since last year. This is 4.
Ward 4, okay.
Yeah, but most of my activism take place in Ward 1.
Okay.
I really like Federal City College because it was at that time a bastion of black militancy, and I came across many people from the Caribbean, many militant Afro-Americans, etc. And my political views were intensified in that particular academic environment. And I was part of the last graduating class, which was 1977, and then it becomes UDC. Let me say this. In the menu of Caribbean folk include people in the business sector, people in the international core, people in the entertainment business, people in restaurants. In other words, our presence here has influenced this culture. When you go to Rita's right there on Georgia Avenue, when you go to the restaurant right here on U Street, okay?
Islander.
Yeah, Islander. Those people have shaped a taste for many of these gentrifiers that may not be able to afford to go to the Caribbean, so they experience their Caribbeanness right there on 11th and U, and that is fine.
And the next one is Joy Ford Austin. She's the executive director of the DC Humanities. And when I applied for the grant, I didn't know she was from Guyana, but ultimately it came out. And she's very passionate about the arts, humanities, and blending scholarship, archival history, and try to figure out a space where both of these things could exist. And she gave us an interview, and here's a snapshot of that interview. maybe not. Okay, well, I'll just continue then. So what ultimately came out from the interview, if you were looking at creating some kind of themes or things that ran together, Federal City College pulled a lot of people from different places that wanted to see the Black experience exposed a little bit more. So I would say out of the 7 or so people I interviewed, at least 4 of them had a connection to Federal City College. They all played a prominent role in the city in one form or another, right? And one of the questions I ended with was, what role did their heritage play in helping them become successful in their chosen field? And it turned out to be a very pivotal part of that, from their parents to their grandparents. Stories, initiatives about being ambitious, education, all those things stayed with them from a child, and it actually helped them become more successful. And you would find, for example, you had Kojo Namdi, who came from a working class background. You had Nia Albert, both from Guyana, who came from, his dad worked for the government. They lived in a house. They had people that helped them. But once they got here, none of that made a difference from back home to here. Once they got here, it was a clean slate, and everybody had an opportunity to be successful. And if you want to see the rest of the interviews, you can just go to the website, motcd.org. And the last thing I would say is, from the panelists yesterday, and you talked about images dealing with Panama and the marginalization of women. And there was a documentary called The Diggers about Panama. And within that, they talked about the women that came from Barbados every 6 months as businesswomen. They weren't subservient. They came to actually create an economy with the workers from the Caribbean then back home, and they bought food, they bought merchandise, they bought goods. So they played a very pivotal role in the building of the Panama Canal, unlike the images that you talked about yesterday, where they seem to be very marginalized and segmented in a particular way. So, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I want to thank the organizers for inviting Elizabeth and I to give this presentation. The conversation so far has been really exciting. Looking forward to extending it. I'm going to talk a little bit. First, I'll give an overview of the project and its goals and theoretical concerns. I'll then highlight some of the scholarly and pedagogical possibilities of the project, and then Elizabeth is going to jump up here, and she's going to conclude by discussing, in addition to more aspects of the theory, some more of the practical aspects of the project. So the Early Caribbean Digital Archive is an interactive scholarly database housed at Northeastern University in Boston University. The inspiration for the archive came during a symposium of the Early Caribbean Society in fall 2011. One of the important issues that came out of this international meeting of scholars from a variety of disciplines working on early Caribbean studies were problems of accessibility to the texts of this era. Documentary materials, particularly about the colonial Caribbean, are often located in archives and collections in various colonial metropoles in Great Britain, France, Germany, Denmark, Spain, etc. Okay, and some of this you'll already heard or you know already. Neocolonial consolidation has transmitted other archives and collections to the United States. In addition, although many of the contemporary archives in the Caribbean are accessible, some are not, and some other documents remain in private hands scattered across the globe. With these difficulties at the forefront of our minds, my colleague Elizabeth Maddock-Dillon and I wrote and received an interdisciplinary program development seed grant from Northeastern to create this digital archive of early colonial texts. Working initially with scholars from a number of departments across campus, as well as graduate students, we envision the archive as an open access interdisciplinary project that brings together scholars of early Caribbean texts, network analysis, network visualization, archival digitization, library sciences, as well as graduate and undergraduate students to create a digital archive of poetry, narratives, nonfiction, and letters. And these are, from the 16th to the 19th century in the Caribbean, and then responses to those articles about them as well. So we've partnered with the Digital Library of the Caribbean to assist in acquiring and making accessible primary documents for open source access, and we're also working with physical archives such as the American Antiquarian Society, which has one of the largest and most complete archives of early Caribbean newspapers. As well as we're also cooperating with existing archives such as the Early Americas Digital Archives developed by Ralph Bauer at the University of Maryland. As we continue to develop our project, we're looking for ways of including and supporting similar work by Caribbean scholars and connecting with other existing archives. The ECDA has two primary related overarching goals. The first is to uncover and make accessible these pre-20th century Caribbean writing, and the second is to facilitate scholarly interactions with these texts. In terms of the first, right, as I've already said, right, there's currently a gap in archives, especially the digital archives. Most of the, let me back up. In terms of the first, there's currently a gap in archives, especially digital archives, devoted solely to pre-20th century Caribbean writing. So most of the digital archives focused on 20th century and 21st century stuff, okay? Or the post-colonial Caribbean. Of the early digital archives that do exist, most are incredibly broad with a more hemispheric, very often US-based framework, such as the Maryland database. Moreover, because of the complicated imperial colonial history of the Caribbean region with bureaucratic control often based in European metropolitan centers and compounded by frequent changes in colonial administration, much of the documentation of the colonial era is divided among many locations. So for example, if you wanted to see a complete run of some colonial Caribbean newspapers, you would have to visit 3 different countries. By making these texts more readily accessible, it is our hope that more scholars will engage with these texts and contribute further to the international scholarly project of understanding colonial Caribbean cultures and literary histories. The second primary goal of the archive, and this is just the front splash page, the second primary goal of the archive is to create and facilitate interactive interfaces necessary for enabling further and more complex analyses of these texts. In other words, we want to go beyond collecting, cataloging, and digitizing of these texts. That is the current paradigm for most digital archives. Instead, we want users to be able to interact with the texts in various ways, such as highlighting important contextual information or key rhetorical details and patterns, tracking certain words and phrases, tracking languages, people, places, commodities, flora, fauna, representations of emotional states, etc. Okay? As well as thinking about the relationships and movements among these. So for example, using network analysis could allow users to generate a map of relations among the locations of slave narrative print activity, as well as between and among individuals. And I do have a map that some of my undergraduate students created, so I'm going to show that to you in a little bit. Let's see. So you could also, map out the relationships between individuals, such as printers, consumers, merchants, runaways, maroons, enslaved peoples, free people of color, missionaries, plantation owners, abolitionists, military, and political figures. So if you think about it, right, mapping all of those relationships would be something really cool and interesting to see. You could also map the frequency of formal, so this means lodged with a local magistrate, slave complaints of mistreatment in relation to changing laws concerning slave punishment and slave marriage. You could also map the textual appearances of descriptions of sugarcane slavery in fiction and poetry alongside print advertisements of sugar or news of sugar boycotts in Europe. Okay, so tracking the appearances of various names across the narratives might be used not only to catalog, but also to view relationships and various kinship systems existent across the colonial system, the colonial Caribbean, sorry. Enhanced digital textual analysis will also allow us to more closely analyze and track the discursive and rhetorical permutations within and across the narratives. So Elizabeth's going to talk about this in more detail, but right now, when you search through the narratives, you're searching them individually. You're not searching across all of them. So you have to do one search and then search the other document and then search the other document. So what we are proposing and developing will be a search tool that will allow you to search across all of those documents, okay? But that's not going to be for a couple of years. So we're in the process of doing that. So beyond questions of authenticity, right, whether or not a particular individual wrote a text, and I think that's probably the least interesting aspect of the digital analysis, textual analysis could also contribute to understanding the free-floating literacies within slave cultures that scholars such as Walter Johnson has suggested might have existed. And again, I'm going to talk about that again in a little bit. By working in conjunction with experts on network analysis and visualization, as well as digital textual analysis, we're hoping to facilitate and build new models for accessing and understanding historical print and visual archives. Let me see. In terms of organization of the archives, I'm just going to show you, this is an exhibit that I'm currently developing on the early Caribbean slave narrative. And so this is, when you come to the archive, and I should say the archive we're in the process of revamping the website. We noticed that there were a couple of bugs as we were preparing to come here today. So it's not online right now, but it will be probably at the end of this week or the end of next week. And we plan to have our official opening, I think in spring, is that right, or fall? Spring. Okay, spring. So this is one of the exhibits. There are some other exhibits on Caribbean foodways, as well as Obi, and on Haiti as well, as I recall. In terms of its organization, the archive will consist of, it'll also have these exhibits such as this. So we have these three, but there are many more, obviously, that could be developed. The archive will also consist of collections of related texts, like the Caribbean archive, like the Slave Narrative Archive, images and sound files. The Caribbean archive does have a sound file. We have been working with Jerome Handler, who worked with Marcia Burroughs, who recorded one of the 1799 narratives, Sybil's narrative, and there's a wonderful audio of her reading this narrative. And so to hear her do it in this voice, which I played for my classes, it's just really incredibly remarkable. So let me see. Oh my goodness. Okay, let me go really quickly then. I didn't realize that was 10 minutes. The place of the slave narrative in the archive resonates with this with this Hogarth painting of the family. It illuminates the fact that some lives were pushed to the margins, while society may have wanted to overlook them or restructure them, right there as silently laboring bodies or passive decorative objects. That's just impossible, and because the lighting in here is kind of odd, what you can't see is that there's a black figure in the lower left-hand side who's holding a tray with silver, and so what happened was it looks like whoever commissioned this painting tried to decided to crop it in order to make it fit into a frame, but they could not crop out the black figure, so the black figure is still there. And so in my own work, I'm arguing that there's something similar going on in the archives, where these slave voices are embedded in these other texts. And one of the great things about digital analysis is that with this digital analysis, you'll be able to pull these texts out and bring them together and basically bring them to voice. So just an analog example I want to share with you very quickly is this is Joanna Stedman. Right, so this is John Stedman's wife, and she in 1824. So Stedman's narrative comes out in 1796. It's incredibly popular. One of the most popular aspects of the narrative is Joanna's narrative, so his discussion of his wife and how he came to meet her and live with her and all this stuff. People were very fascinated with her life, and so what happened in 1820 is some anonymous author excised all of the sections having to do with Joanna and then put them together with some connecting material and then had that circulate as a separate slave narrative. So this is 14 years before Lydia Maria Child does the same exact thing. So there's already, right, historically speaking, right, this process of going into these texts and finding the stuff and bringing it out. Infinitely easier, right, with digital technology. I also wanted to share Maureen M. Narbesi-Philip Zong's book, Book of Poetry, which is based on the transcript from the trial of the Zong. And so my thinking is that if she was able to use this awful transcript to create these wonderful, lyrical, beautiful poems, some of them in the voices of the slaves, then certainly we should, right, as scholars, be able to do something similarly in the archives, acknowledging, right, that these are not going to be authentic, right, slave narratives in terms of representations written by the particular individual. Okay, so I'm going to fly through this really quickly and actually just skip my talk and just extemporize. So in my own work, I'm interested in exploring this narrative I found in the Philadelphia Historical Society, which is the memoir of the life of Florence Hall. It's handwritten on scrap paper. It's just in the archive in this loose archival box. There's a bunch of other pro-slavery materials around it. And so although scholars know about this document, they tend not to treat it. They tend to ignore it because it's unsigned, because it's undated, and because it's just in this box and no one knows its provenance, that kind of thing. We do know it's an authentic document. We just don't know if she actually wrote it. What?
I thought you were each taking 10, but 10 minutes each, but you're going to take 20?
I'm not going to take 20. I'm almost done. Like 2 minutes, okay? I promise. Okay, so this is an image that's pretty interesting. So this image, right? Through digital technology, we could circulate this and get some input in terms of what this image what that image is of. I've been using it in my classes. I'm just going to show you some examples. So this is a map of all of the Caribbean slave narratives, where the slaves came from, where the enslaved individuals came from, where the narratives were published, where the narratives were found and circulated, and just you can see just how much movement there is, right, within this narrative. So totally complicates our understanding about Caribbean slave narratives. This is a mapping of Mary Prince's narrative. Again, you see a lot more movement, right, than you would have realized. Okay, so these are all projects that my students did. Oh, this didn't come out right. So this is a essay assignment. I have my student on essay, a digital assignment that I give them the opportunity to do. So far, I've had 6 students do that. One of the students is now going to be joining us to work on the early Caribbean archive. And I'm just going to skip all of this stuff. All right.
Okay, I'm going to jump right in here. The promise of the digital archive is one of infinite access and endless accumulation. And with this expansive possibility comes a promise as well of the democratization of knowledge. In the digital world, anyone can build an archive and everyone can use it. But the shape of the archive has always been determined by relations of power. Michel Foucault, for instance, defines the archive as, quote, first and foremost the law of what can be said, the system that governs the appearance of statements as unique events, end quote. The archive, Foucault argues, helps to define what is speakable and what is unspeakable. What bearing, then, do these claims have on the digital archive? As you've just heard from Nicole, the ECDA is a newly founded digital collection of pre-1900 texts and images from the Caribbean. And I want to give a shout out here to the truly amazing graduate students, Elizabeth Hopwood and Ben Doyle, who have done the lion's share of the work on putting together the archive. in my remarks here, I want to try to consider how the ECDA is being constructed in such a way that some of the silences of the colonial archive might be addressed and redressed, not simply by way of accumulation, but by way of strategies of digital remix and curation aimed at changing structures of knowledge that have rendered the history of the Black Atlantic and the Caribbean what Simon Gikandi has called a deep crypt, in which the voices of the enslaved have been silenced and immured within the archive of early capitalist modernity. In her essay, Colonial Archives and the Arts of Governance, Anne-Laura Stoller argues that it's not simply the contents of the colonial archive that matter, but the form of the archive itself. The colonial archive is, quote, a cross-section of contested knowledge on which power relations are inscribed, together with intricate technologies of rule. What constitutes the archive, what form it takes, and what systems of classification signal at specific times are the very substance of colonial politics. End quote. As such, Stoller argues the colonial archive should be understood not as a site of knowledge retrieval, but of knowledge production. In other words, we should not turn to the colonial archive to excavate the hidden documents of the past, but should do so to understand how the production, circulation, and housing of documents themselves are part and parcel of a colonial technology of rule, are part and parcel of what we might call the epistemology of coloniality, how colonialism thinks and constructs the world. This colonial epistemology is inscribed in the archive, and I would argue to the extent that we reproduce this archive and its formal terms of knowledge production digitally, we remain within a colonial episteme. In her discussion of the colonial archive, Stoller is largely referring to the documents of the colonial state, but I would argue that her insights are germane to a broader account of the archive as well, one including non-state generated materials as well as official documents. We now have millions and millions of pages of material available at our fingertips as more materials are digitized. What then is the bearing of the digital on these issues of the colonial archive and the relations of power inscribed therein? If, to return to Foucault, the archive is, quote, that which at the very root of the statement event defines at the outset the system of its enunciability, end quote, then does the digital archive allow for new knowledge production, new statement events, new enunciations? So let me begin with an example of a digital archive where the answer to this question, I think, is no. This is a project called SNAC, the Social Network and Archives Project, that's being developed at the Institute for Advanced Technology and the Humanities at the University of Virginia. It's an ambitious project that links archives and biographical information from all kinds of sources to one searchable network. The idea is to allow you to search social networks of history. SNAC has put together 2.6 million records that they've drawn from WorldCat, from British Library, from the Library of Congress, name authority. But take a quick look at who appears on this page. Here's another page. By aggregating these existing records, what's produced is the historical assumption that the activities and writings of many white men are significant, worth enunciating, worth preserving, whereas those of the rest of the world largely are not. To be fair, I know that this is a concern of the developer, Daniel Pitti, who's working on SNAC, but let me suggest that the problem here is one that might be understood not simply as an issue of content, but one of form. If the form of the archive is the aggregation of existing databases of names, the historical contours of those databases will necessarily be reproduced in the digital archive. So I want to argue that in terms of digital humanities, it's only by an engagement with form and the possibilities of design, redesign, reforming, and deforming the colonial archive that an anti-colonial work might emerge. So what does this look like? In the ECDA, as indicated, one of the things that we aim to archive and foreground is previously buried and embedded histories, narratives, and cultural practices of diasporic Africans and Afro-Creole enslaved peoples in the Caribbean, thereby creating a new body of reassembled or remixed text and knowledge. So we're aiming not to just aggregate things, but also to change the form in which they appear. So we now have a two-step plan for this archive. The first is the Omeka site that Nicole showed you, which actually a version of that is up right now at ecdaproject.org, if you want to take a look. And the second is a much larger, more ambitious project that doesn't exist yet, which will be a TEI encoded corpus of texts. And that encoding is what's going to allow us to do the kind of network analysis that Nicole was talking about. Okay, so TEI is a kind of encoding. It's like HTML. It allows you to encode a text, but it's the standard sort of high-quality way to create a literary or historical edition online. And TEI allows you to encode not just formal aspects of a text, so not just like a paragraph or a header, but also any content in that material. So one of the things that we've done in developing our TEI is create, for instance, an element, a marker for an embedded or an interpolated slave narrative. So this is an example of remix that I'm going to talk about. This is Hans Sloane, the creator of the British Museum. He was also a doctor who practiced in Jamaica for some time. This is a book he wrote called Voyage to the Islands of Madeira, Barbados, Nieves, St. Christopher, and Jamaica. And I'm just going to give you a short example of an embedded slave narrative that we're marking these texts and what it means to mark that text. So I'm not going to read this for the sake of time, but please take a look. It's a story of an enslaved man named Emmanuel. He's asked to help Sloane and some others go find a pirate ship, at which point he says that he's ill, that he's lame, I believe. And Sloane, thinking himself very clever, says that he knows how to cure this by applying candles to his feet, and because he thinks that Emmanuel is faking. And then Sloane kind of prides himself on developing this miraculous cure to show that Emmanuel is faking. But what's very cool about this is the last sentence, which is that he says that was the best remedy I knew for him. He went about his errand immediately after this remedy and performed it well, though he came too late for the pirates, right? So in effect, Emmanuel won this round, you could say, right? So what has happened here is that you by extracting this story, by marking it as a slave narrative, then we're able to turn it into a different kind of account than the one that it has within Sloane's texts. And so by marking, the idea is that we can actually reach into the existing archive and create a new set of texts from within that, and disembedding them, remixing them, gives them a different set of meanings than the ones that they have, or that they have had. Okay, so remix then enables one to change the hierarchy of knowledge. At a very basic level, remix involves breaking a given text into component parts and rearranging the parts of the text to generate new forms of understanding out of a new textual structure. I want to end with two brief points. The first is, I was thinking last night about what is the specific connection between the Caribbean and the digital, right? Why that intersection here? And one of the answers to that would be, Laurent talked about the field as one that is interested in questions of marginalization and silence, and I would say that the digital archive allows one to rethink what I would call the hegemony of text, and particularly the hegemony of the codex, of the book form. So this digital archive, this principle of remix, I think enables us to unbind the book, as it were, right? And unbind some of the knowledge structures that inform the book, which would include authorship, right? So Hans Sloane's book has the word Hans Sloane on the title, but instead we're putting the word Emmanuel on the title of this narrative. So authorship, forms of linguistic imperialism, and the prioritization of print over the visual, the sonic, and the performative. Right. So the digital archive allows a rethinking of that, of the structure of knowledge of the codex that has engaged in some of the imperial domination in the Caribbean. Finally, my last point, I want to conclude with just a short thought about digital humanities and the humanities and the digital. I think it's sometimes a mistake to imagine that the digital will save the humanities. I think this is what my provost thinks, that the humanities are somehow being saved from their irrelevance by hooking up with hot and fast new technology. In fact, I think the opposite may be the case, that the humanities will save the digital. We live in a world where the formal aspects of technology shape what counts as knowledge, what is speakable and what is unspeakable. We need all the more modes of humanities analysis that let us ask not what is in the box or how to count boxes, but to ask who made the box, why they made it, and how and why we might care about what the box has rendered visible and uncountable as well as countable. Thank you.